I'd like to welcome you guys to this week's report, or actually video, not really a report. Today is February 20th. It's a Thursday afternoon. Better weather this week. There are some fish to be caught, but not a ton of coverage, so I'm going to talk a little bit about inshore conditions and how to find biting fish in a number of scenarios while fishing inshore. Before I get started, I'd like to wish a happy 95th birthday to my dad, Hans. Today's his birthday. He's already bugging me to take him fishing this year, so I have to do that. And he's been watching my videos lately, so I figured I'd say hello. Born in 1930, left home at 12 years old. To go work construction during World War II. Ended up spending time in different parts of Germany and Europe. Well into Hitler Youth, which was a forced work camp for young boys back then, digging trenches for trench warfare, different things like that. He ended up immigrating to Canada when he was 18 years old or 17 years old, spent 6 or 8 years there, and then doing a number of horrible jobs, logging, mining, railroad, all kinds of stuff you wouldn't want to do. Before moving to the United States, and finally settling here in California after traveling around the country for a couple of years in a homeless, basically in a car, and ended up started selling guns at the swap meet. Met somebody there doing that. They opened a gun shop, and my dad had that Southwestern Guns in Bell, California for 40-something years until he retired in his late 70s. He spent the last 20 years just hanging out, having a good time. So happy birthday to you, Dad. A couple of weeks ago I talked about offshore conditions and what to look for and understanding currents and things like that. And it's pretty similar with inshore stuff, except it's on a smaller and more localized scale. So there's two really determining factors when it comes to conditions inshore. That's going to be current and tide. Water temperature, things like that come into play, clarity as well. Yeah, but current and tide are your biggest factors. And the tide is more dependent on certain species than others. For example, calico bass couldn't care less about tide. Spotted bass in the harbor rely on tide to move water, so they're very tide dependent. Sea bass can be a very tidal bite, as do halibut, and I think that has to do with water going in and out of shallow beaches. We'll talk about all those things a little bit later. But so the basic thing is with all this, and this is something that my friend Todd Manser said the best way anybody ever could a while back, is that once current starts running, the treadmill starts for fish, and they now suddenly have to swim to hold their position. And fish being fish and evolving over millions of years, they've learned instinctually that when that current runs, it's time to start looking for food because those calories they're burning need to be replaced. So, if you've ever been fishing anywhere, any of the islands, local, whatever, and there's just no current at all, the boat's just swinging around on the anchor, or you're not drifting, there's bait around, it's all pointing in different directions, there's fish in the meter but they're not biting. That's happening because those fish don't feel that they need to feed at that time because they're not burning any calories. The bait fish aren't actively looking for nutrients to eat because they're not burning any calories, and the fishing's probably going to suck. You might catch a fish or two, but overall it's not going to be great. So what happens? The current starts running. So what makes current run? We talked about in that previous video. There's normal currents that happen cyclically throughout the year, and then we have wind-driven currents that run in different areas. There's also upwellings. There's a number of different things. While those are interesting to hear about, you don't really need to know. Current is something that's either happening or not happening. So once you get past there being current, it's important to know which direction the current is going in the area that you're fishing. Any coastal kelp bed or rocky shoreline or shallower water or at an island, along a beach, front side of San Clemente Island, Pukey Point off the north end of the Coronados, you need current running in a direction that's going to be parallel to the structure that the fish may be inhabiting to. So when you're fishing along the beach, current running up or down the beach is good. If you're fishing an island, current running parallel to the shoreline of the island is good. What that means is that now, pretty much in all situations, this gives an opportunity for fish to relate to structure. And while it applies to all things, the easiest example is a kelp bed, because it's visual. You can actually see what's happening other than knowing which way the current's going. If there's kelp along a beach, and there's a leading edge to that kelp bed, when I say the leading edge, that is the up current edge of the kelp bed. Water is running straight at that kelp. Bass will set up in that kelp on the front edge, waiting for current to bring bait fish, and then for them to, shoot out and eat that bait fish. So when current's running parallel to the beach, they have the opportunity to not only line up in the front of the bed, but on the sides of the bed as well, the outer edge of the bed, we'll call it, the side away from shore. If that current is running parallel to the shoreline, that entire expanse becomes huntable ground for calico bass. And they can line up anywhere in there and ambush bait, and then, you'll have like a little saddle in the kelp bed or something. That becomes a secondary point, and it makes a lot of sense. From an angling point of view anyway. If that current is going straight into the beach, now there is only a wall of kelp with current going into it, and there's no definable leading edge. It's all a leading edge, but now where are the fish going to be? And more importantly, how are you going to be able to position your boat to work that leading edge of the current is pushing you straight into the kelp the whole time? Equally, if the current is going off the beach, there's nothing going to be at the leading edge, because the leading edge of that bed will be against the shoreline. Unless there's bait fish coming down the hillside, there's nothing there for the bass to eat. So I use the kelp bed and calico bass as an example because it kind of sums up how all this stuff works. Let's take something a little different. Let's say a spot at San Clemente Island on the front side of the island. There's this 90-foot flat spot along the island that's pretty consistent, and there are some reefs that go across that where it's outcroppings from land. Each of those reefs creates a pinch point on the hose as the current's running parallel to the island, and that creates an upwelling which aggregates bait fish to eat the plankton, which will attract game fish. But for that spot to work properly, the current has to be running parallel to the island. If it's running into the island, it's not having that same effect because that pinch point's not there. And if it's running off the island, that's the same exact thing. Now there's nothing to orient those bait fish, and by association, the predators go along with them. Same can be said for a rock in deep water. Let's say off the backside of Clemente off Lost Point, or let's say Farnsworth Bank of Catalina. Each of those spots has a preferred direction because that spot creates the best feeding environment for bait fish in a certain current direction, and the game fish will be there to eat those fish. There's some spots that like an uphill current, which means it's going south to north. There's other spots that like a downhill current. There's certain areas as well that like a current into, like if you're at Farnsworth Bank and a current's running in towards the island, you can still fish it because it's a circular bank, and you could the pinnacles there, you can fish from any direction, and they all fish pretty much the same. Whereas other spots like Gold Bluff at the front side of Clemente is not going to fish well on a outgoing current or a going in towards the beach. So basically, if there's a spot that has topography that's associated with land, like a ridge coming out into the water perpendicular to the flow of the current, that's going to be a two-directional spot to fish. It's either be up the beach or down the beach. If you have a spot like Farnsworth Bank that sits out away from the island and has open water on all sides of it, that is a spot that potentially you could fish at any current direction as long as there's current, but there are going to be preferred current directions at that spot as well, because they are the most effective at creating the thumb over the hose and aggregating the bait fish. So, yeah, so you're gonna have to figure some of that stuff out. Some of it's simple, like the stuff that's relating to structure that's associated with a landmass is always going to be better when the current is running parallel to the beach. If it's a standalone spot out away from everything, any current can be good current, but there are going to be directions that are better than others. Like the rock pile off San Diego. Trying to think of other spots. There's any of the spots on horseshoe kelp, artificial reefs around deep water. They're going to have particular current directions they bite best in, but normally a downhill current, which would be north to south, on most coastal spots is usually the preferred setup, just as a rule of thumb. So I talked about tides. Tides change things, especially with sea bass. A lot of times fish will bite on a slack tide, bluefin, come up foaming on a slack tide, marlin bite on a slack tide. That period of slack tide, my friend Sean Morgan had a interesting point, is that at the slack tide, high or low, is when the ocean goes quiet, and the water stops moving up and down. The fish can hunt better. I don't know. He's got a lot of marlin, so it does make sense. It's just something to think about. Something happens on that slack tide, and sea bass is the same way. Yellows can be that way. A tide change can create or kill a bite. So if you're doing that kind of stuff, you're going to have to track your tides and try and make some assumptions that, just like with tuna fishing or marlin fishing, you want to be in your highest percentage spot an hour before a tide change, so you can be there if that spot does bite. So talking a little bit about being at spots, I think that's real popular this time of year is guys fishing sea bass at the island or halibut at the island along beaches and things like that. I don't do much of that. I don't do any of it. I used to. But what I see as a bass fisherman there is that there are a lot of guys anchored up in spots that have that, that sea bass color water, they call it. But they're not relating to anything other than watercolor. And that is not a good place or starting position to go and try and catch these fish. If the island, the entire island has that color water, there's not fish everywhere in there. So what you have to find is, whatever today's condition is, you need to find a little variation of that condition. And a lot of times, fishing along beaches, halibut, sea bass, calico bass is the same way. You find an area that's got a little bit of dirty water that's a different color than the rest of it, and there's some, foam on the surface that's caused by current. That current rip right there allows fish to hide in dirtier water, to potentially eat bait fish that are coming in cleaner water and are unaware of those fish being in that dirtier water. The thing is, the guys that know how to fish sea bass and halibut and stuff, they're already going to be on most of those spots if the island is crowded. So if you're in the crowded area, I would leave that crowded area and go and see if you can find some conditions like that yourself. And basically all you're looking for is a small area where the conditions are different than they are everywhere else. And that might be a patch of even cleaner water, or dirtier water is usually the key. And a lot of times the water will look ugly. It's like, that just looks like there shouldn't be fish there. It's just loaded with fish because that's where they're hiding. So, speaking of something else I don't do is anchor. I do know how to anchor though. And when you're anchoring up to fish a spot, be it a beach where there might be a sea bass or halibut, be it a spot on the front side of Clemente, or an area at Coronado Islands, or Farnsworth Bank at Catalina, you want to set your boat up so that you're not on top of the spot. So a good rule of thumb is, if you're fishing for bottom fish, you want to be right on top of the fish. If you're fishing for anything that's not on the bottom, you want to be a distance ahead of the spot, up current of it. And if the fish is likely to break you off like a yellowtail or something, you want to be even further away from that spot. So basically, you're setting up current of the spot, and you're basing the amount of current on how far to put your boat ahead. So if it's very little current, you wouldn't be as great of a distance away as if the current's ripping, because it's going to move your bait, move your chum, everything much faster, give you a bigger lane. I had a couple of graphics here that I'm going to include here if I can find them on my computer, but they show how to anchor up in different conditions. I've used them in an article before. I think I've used them here as well. But yeah, you want to position your boat in a position where your lines are getting to where the fish are without having your boat be on top of it, if at all possible. Now, if you're fishing a beach for halibut or sea bass, that's going to be a very small variation between where the boat is, where the stern of the boat is, and where this spot is. You know, it might be 20 feet behind the boat, 30 feet behind the boat. If you're fishing, a spot on the front side of Clemente and there's big yellows biting, you might want to be a couple hundred feet ahead of that spot so you have a chance of catching those fish without getting broke off by them. But yeah, know which way your boat anchors. And even guys that have a spot lock trolling motor, same thing holds true. That trolling motor makes noise, and if you could be a little bit further away from those fish, they're less likely to associate that with your boat. And just pay attention to the current. If you're trying to fish for a sea bass with a squid and a lead head or a slang sinker, and you're casting out the right size lead heads, like a half-ounce lead head or slider or whatever, and you're sinking straight to the bottom, you either have no current or you don't have enough current. You need to adjust. So you want to have your bait fall to where those fish are likely to be. Those fish are likely to be where that bait fish is feeding on the plankton that's coming from the thumb over the hose. The last thing I'm going to say here is talk about chumming. I don't carry bait on my boat. I've spent a lot of my life fishing with bait, so I know how it goes. As a private boater, your best chumming scenario is to get a chum bucket if you're fishing on the anchor at a spot. They got them at all tackle stores. You poke some holes in the top, tie it on a rope, hang it off your transom. What that does is it creates the same thing that happens when the thumb goes over the hose and the plankton gets built up and the bait fish get on it. Now you're creating your own thumb over the hose by putting out that just chum that's basically liquid. Bait fish are coming and eating that. Game fish will show up. I can't tell you how many times we'd be at Catalina with the chum bucket out, and first we start getting smelt, sardines, then a bunch of calico bass, and you see everything split and a few yellows will swim through. And you don't have to waste your bait supply to do that. You can just, fish. Same thing if you're fishing with squid, chop it up, chum it over. One of the problems with squid is you end up with a bunch of blacksmith and blue perch behind your boat, and you cast your squid on your hook back there, and it's like throwing it into a wood chipper. It's like, okay, that's gone. And then you do that 700 times to catch a sea bass maybe. That's why I don't do it. But bring out that chum bucket, and it's my advice to you is get a 5-gallon bucket and get a 2.5-gallon chum bucket, and when you take the chum bucket out of the water, put it in your 5-gallon bucket, or you're just going to sour your whole boat. But that type of stuff, and you can tell how the current's going, and you can see. So a lot of times when there's wind blowing, your boat's going to want to lay with the wind. But if you got a chum bucket out and you can see the chum drifting, you can say, hey, the chum is actually going to the 45-degree angle. I'm not anywhere near position right on the spot. So if my boat's in the right position, I'm parallel to the shoreline, this is in the right spot. So you can take that as a cue, because if that's the case, there's not, let's say it's a spot on an island, let's say on the front side of Clemente, you got your chum bucket out, it's going this way, your boat's laying this way. The spot's back here, it's not seeing chum, there's no thumb over the hose where the spot is, there's no bait fish around or anything like that. So, a lot of little things, but yeah, I guess that kind of covers it, and I'll be back next week with talking about some of the stuff to see at the PCS show. They just came out with the seminar speakers. I'm going to do a inshore seminar on Thursday at 1:30, I think. And I will be at the show at Matt Koch's booth. He's known as fish painter, did a lot of crazy fish paintings. I'll be there all weekend. It's right across from the Batson Enterprises booth, Brain Shadow Rods, Alps Components. And Matt's got a 20-foot booth this year, so he's got a lot more stuff. And we'll talk more about it next week, and I hope to see you guys there. But I'm actually going to fish Saturday, going to shoot photos for an article on calico bass fishing in the Kelp with Gary Reyes. I don't know if we're fishing Cat or Clemente, but happy to get out. It's been a while. And that's it. So we've got decent weather in the weekend forecast pretty much everywhere. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, and good luck if you fish.